Okay, everybody, for the sake of all the sessions, by the way, today are being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days or weeks, just to let everyone know. So now I moved on to Nikon, and then about 15 years ago moved to Canon. I'm currently shooting with a Canon R6 mirrorless and a 5 DSLR. And I also add the iPhone 13 Pro Max to my list of cameras. In fact, I bought it primarily as a camera, less as a cell phone. I do about 80% personal and 20% what I would consider to be professional, because it's for client product photography, architectural photography, and things like that related to the web business. Oh, I need to say, got it, click here. Got it. So about this talk, the idea is to give a practical overview of available technology. Computers don't take better pictures than humans, at least not yet, but they do take over many tricky and mundane functions, letting us focus on composition and artistic factors. And although, I really hate the fix it in post connotation, which is that you can sort of take almost any really bad shot and then fix it later, you really can rescue a lot of images that otherwise would be on the floor. And this talk is applicable to all makes and models of digital cameras as well as cell phones, because most cell phones, especially higher end cell phones, have really sophisticated camera and video capabilities, for that matter. Mostly talking about still photography, but it would be an interesting thing to have talk like this about video photography, which gets into a little bit more complication, although some of the tools that I'm talking about are actually available in video for video as well. And I'm going to avoid these constant religious debates that pop up in this photography field, like JPEG versus RAW, Canon versus Nikon, stuff like that. One thing I would note is, as smart as cameras get, you still have to remember to remove the lens cap. So photography, as you know, is governed by the immutable laws of physics. And I always think it's a little bit similar to Ginsburg's theorem on thermodynamics, but a twist. You can't win, you can break even, and you definitely can't get out of the game. And breaking even in photography is all based around this thing that everybody knows about, the exposure triangle. On one side is ISO, essentially the sensitivity of the sensor or the film that you're shooting with, the shutter speed on one hand, and the aperture on the bottom. And you can change any one of these, but if you've reached the point of correct exposure, you can change any one of these, but you're going to have to change one of the other ones to compensate. So you can increase aperture, but it's going to let in more light, but then you might have to reduce shutter speed in order to compensate. Or you can raise your shutter speed, but then you might need to increase ISO to compensate. But the problem with that is that creates an image that might have more noise. So all of these have pluses and minuses. And unfortunately, there's really no solution until you start looking at some of these new tools that employ artificial intelligence to essentially break out of what is the laws of physics. And that's kind of the point of this talk, is that you can sort of start bending the laws of physics with some of these tools that are out there. Here's a shot I took about a week ago of a very friendly fox that lives around our place here that we see all the time. And he's gotten to the point where he doesn't run away anymore. And he just sort of stands there, or she, I think it's actually a she. People have told me it's a female fox. She just sort of sits there and lets me take her picture time and time again. So it's gotten to be kind of a fun thing to do. But if the shutter speed was too low, it's very likely there would have been motion blur. So to compensate for that, I increased the shutter speed, which reduces the amount of light coming to the sensor. So it's a darker image. So I bump up the ISO and I get a noisy image. And the bottom line there is you get to the point of wanting to pull your hair out at that point. And I haven't even gotten into issues like focus and bokeh and all these other things that you need to think about when you're taking photographs like that. None of this is really new to digital photography. It's physics. I mean, we had issues with more sensitive films, like if you remember shooting in black and white in film days, Tri-X was a very fast but grainy film. So it's essentially some of the same problems that existed in film photography exist in digital photography. The thing is that in the digital domain, cameras and post-processing can be game changers. Any questions up to this point?
No.
So who invented the digital camera? Anybody know? Kodak.
Yeah, I thought it was Kodak.
And, you know, it looks pretty portable. Oops, here's the rest of it. Wasn't really that portable. And I think the resolution was something like 100 pixels by 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels was the resolution that they were shooting at, which wasn't very much. In fact, I think it was actually less than that because I don't think it was a megapixel. But there's the one of the first digital images. By the way, if you look out there for the first digital image, you're going to see a different image. And that's because the first digital image was taken by a scanner, not by a camera. So there's a little bit of a distinction between the two, but that is the first digital photograph that was taken with a camera. So don't forget to bring your cell phone along, by the way. I love this shot. Things have gotten a lot smaller. So just to show how things have changed from the days when Kodak was #1 in cameras and in film, #1 company in things that take pictures today is Samsung. And of course, those are multifunction devices, cell phones that take pictures. #1 in actual cameras is Canon. And #1 in image sensors is Sony. Sony builds image sensors for almost everybody except Canon. So digital photography was kind of a laboratory curiosity until a couple of things came around and changed the game. One of those things was the release and introduction of the digital single lens reflex camera. The first ones came from around the same time from Canon and Nikon. If you recall, if you remember back to those days, the first digital single lens reflex cameras actually were analog film cameras with digital backs. A lot of SLRs back in those days had removable backs that would allow for larger film cartridges. One of the backs that was introduced for it by Canon was a digital back that had a digital sensor in it instead of film, and recorded, a very small number of relatively low resolution photographs, but nevertheless was very useful for news photographers and people who wanted to very rapidly turn around an image from taking it to displaying it someplace. So of course, the similarity between a SLR and a DSLR was the fact that it had a mirror that would allow you to focus through the lens and see what almost exactly, and in some cases exactly with 100% accuracy, what you were shooting at. And when it came time to take the picture, the mirror flips out of the way, exposing the film plane and the shutter. Digital SLRs simply replaced the film plane and the film that was in there with a digital imaging sensor. So it kind of brought pro photography capabilities like interchangeable lenses and other kinds of accessories to digital camera systems. I think game changer number 2 was cell phones. And of course, the introduction of cell phones as a camera device was dependent upon several other things happening. And one of those was the introduction of cloud-based computing, utility computing in the cloud. Because the camera on its own, taking pictures, wasn't really that useful unless you could share them. And I think game changer number 3, which we're in the middle of right now in terms of a big transition, is the mirrorless camera and that transition from DSLR to mirrorless. And what mirrorless does essentially is takes the mirror, which adds a lot of weight and complexity and shake and vibration to the photo taking session, the weight and complexity of pentaprisms and things like that, and replaces it simply with an electronic viewfinder. So you're constantly looking through the sensor to see exactly what the image is that you're going to take when you snap the shutter. Reduces size, weight, and adds all kinds of new capabilities. One thing, there's so much more room by taking out the mirror and the pentaprism, you can put more computing capability into these mirrorless cameras. And of course, as time goes on, they're getting the processing capabilities of these devices are getting more and more powerful and sophisticated. So, for example, here are 2 probably simulations. They're probably not real. Of one capability that I just love in mirrorless cameras, which is eye detect autofocusing. Focus, not too surprisingly, is one of the most important things that you need to do when you're taking a photograph. And a lot of times it's hard, especially with moving subjects. And there are all kinds of capabilities that have been built into DSLRs over the years to track things, birds, especially when you're shooting things like birds in flight or animals that are moving or cars that are driving past, sports cars, motorcycles at a race, things like that. But until the mirrorless cameras came along that have the computing capability built inside of them to actually do things like intelligently detect and track an eye, a face, a bird's eye. Until those capabilities were in place, you were really vastly reducing your ability to take, out of say 10 shots you were taking, if you got one good shot, you were lucky. Nowadays, you can take 10 shots and get 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or sometimes even 9 or 10 good shots out of a group of shots that are being taken. Another big one is in-body image stabilization, especially for somebody like me. I have essential tremor. And so I have a little bit of a shake all the time. And I've eliminated the problems I've had with that by using in-body image stabilization. I actually eliminated it with lens-based image stabilization, but it's even better with in-body image stabilization. The image stabilization in some of these new cameras from Canon, Nikon, and Sony allow for something like 5 to 8 stops of image stabilization. So you literally can handhold a shot down to like half a second or sometimes even more and get a completely sharp shot out of it, which is pretty incredible. Everybody know Jared Polin, or anyone know Jared Polin or watch his videos? He's one of the most popular photography influencers on YouTube. And what he's famous for is being the person who spreads the gospel of shooting raw images. I'm not going to get into the debate on raw, but I will say that I been shooting RAW for a long time because it's really the only way to take advantage of some of the capabilities that we're going to discuss. So I'll leave it at that. What is RAW, by the way? A RAW file is basically a digital negative. It's unprocessed. So when you look at the pictures, the RAW files that come out of a camera, they're usually very bland and not ready to be put on the web or printed. But they contain a lot more data than a traditional JPEG. Because RAW files contain more data, they have a wider range of possibilities inside Photoshop, Lightroom, or many of the other image editors that are out there that handle RAW files. Basically, you can correct a lot of problems with an image that's been shot if you shoot in RAW, as opposed to shooting with getting finished images like JPEGs out of a camera. And if you're not shooting RAW, what you might want to do is, in many cameras, there's the ability to shoot JPEG and RAW. So we'll save both a JPEG and a RAW file. So at the very least, what you can do is get the JPEGs out of the camera and use them and show them or post them on the web or whatever you're doing with them. But you have the RAW files to save the RAW files. So if you start moving into more sophisticated image editing capabilities down the road, you have those RAW files to turn back to and then play with and perhaps change or improve the images that you shot. I stop, take a drink here. Any questions?
Good.
Anyone? How many people here shoot RAW as opposed to shooting JPEG?
I shoot RAW like all the time.
My daughter majored in photography and she shoots RAW.
Yeah, I shoot RAW and JPEG.
Yeah, I pretty much have moved entirely to shooting JPEG, and in fact, I'm to shooting RAW rather, and been doing it for quite a while. One of the things I'm trying to do right now is to get the iPhone to load the RAWs that it can shoot and it can save into Adobe Creative Cloud, and we'll talk about that later. I haven't been successful yet, but supposedly that capability exists.
Okay, so on the iPhone, every time I pull it up, you need it's not defaulting to RAW. You have to push a button to tell
Yeah,
it to go.
I've gotten RAW. I've gotten it to take RAW. I just haven't gotten the Lightroom program, and we'll talk a little bit more about Lightroom. We'll talk a lot more about Lightroom a little bit. Haven't gotten it to do its move of the files that I'm interested in over to Creative Cloud. They just never seem to show up in the right place. But that's my problem. I'm just not doing something right. Virtually all digital cameras and most cell phones, or at least many cell phones, can record RAW files. So we're going to talk about a couple of programs and capabilities out there and show a couple of examples that I've used and tested. And there's things out there that I haven't used and tested, and I'll mention them. Or if you have any, you might want to bring them up at the end and we can talk about them. But probably the number one application that I use in photography is Adobe Lightroom Classic. And I love Adobe, but they did just about the dumbest thing imaginable by confusing everyone by having Adobe Lightroom and then coming out with Adobe Creative Cloud and then changing Creative Cloud to Lightroom Classic and introducing another program that's completely different called Adobe Creative Cloud, or Adobe Lightroom Cc, which stands for Creative Cloud. The program I use is Lightroom Classic, which is the version of Lightroom that keeps your images on your local computer network, as opposed to storing them in Creative Cloud. So just to remove that distinction. When you buy it,
That's the
you
desktop.
actually get both. The one I would install if I were making a suggestion to anyone would be Lightroom Classic. And Lightroom is essentially a digital darkroom. It's sold as a software as a service application bundled with Photoshop for about $11 a month. Photoshop and Lightroom maybe it's probably going on 8 or 9 years ago, used to be sold as a program that you would buy, and you generally ended up having to replace it or update it every couple of years. Now it's kept up to date automatically, but you pay a monthly fee. And in all honesty, although I was one of those people who was just furious when this originally happened, I've got to say that it's probably the best $11 that I spend every month. And it certainly would never go back to the old way. And a lot of other programs in this field are now being sold in sort of this format. So it does a couple of things that are just amazing. One of them is it catalogs and indexes your image and provides geotagging support. If your camera is capable of geotagging your images, you can do things like bring up a map in Lightroom and see the locations, physical locations where your pictures were taken. So if you were in Berlin, you could click on Berlin on a map and then see the pictures that were shot in Berlin. But perhaps even more important than that is that it allows you to put additional metadata on each image. So you can start so easily search for cat photos, dog photos, bird photos. Although I would say that there's technology coming from Adobe and that will allow you to do things like search for birds, and it will find bird photos using artificial intelligence, using their Sensei technology. The best thing about Lightroom is that it provides non-destructive editing and adjustment capabilities. Essentially, every change you make to an image is saved, and you can always go back to the original, or you can always take out the changes that you previously made. In fact, Lightroom never changes your original raw file, or actually, if you're working in Lightroom in JPEG, never changes your original JPEG. What you can always do at any point is to export the work in progress that you're at, and then post it on the web, send it to someone, print it, or do other things with it as you deem necessary. You can fix exposure, you can fix noise issues, you can do lens corrections, you can do high dynamic range, operations, create panoramas. It has focus stacking support. Now you might say that a lot of cameras can do HDR, panoramas, and focus stacking support. The difference is that Lightroom can do this in raw files. Generally, when you do HDR in a camera body, the output is not raw for you to be able to go back and change it or tweak it. It's generally a JPEG that you're sort of like stuck with and have more limited editing capabilities with. There's a huge range of plugins and presets available. For example, the Canon Pro printing software is available, can be run as a standalone program, but can also be run inside Lightroom. So you don't need to go in and out of the program in order to do printing. You need to shoot in RAW to exploit all the features of Lightroom. It has mobile integration and tethering capabilities. Tethering is really important in some of the shooting that I do. May not be important in everybody's shooting. A lot of times I do product shots for people, just sort of one after the other and they're incorporated into a website. And it's just a lot easier to do the controlling of all of this shooting from a computer than from the camera, especially since the camera sometimes is in a sort of a contorted situation. can't see through the viewfinder without doing a lot of crouching and crawling on the floor and crawling underneath the tripod and stuff like that. Just makes it easier. Lightroom stores your images locally, so you need to consider backup. In fact, this is kind of like something that if you search for, backup Lightroom, you'll find a million different ways that people have figured out how to do this. What I use is I keep them I actually use a Windows PC with a graphics coprocessor for most of the Lightroom work that I do. And I store the images locally, and then they're backed up on a Synology network attached storage server. And the Synology uploads everything every night to Amazon S3 for backup. Not everyone needs such a complicated, I'm kind of in the, web and computer business. So I tend to gravitate towards complicated solutions to simple problems. But there are other much better and easier to use solutions for backup out there. But it's something you need to consider with Lightroom Classic, because you're not backing up your images to the Adobe cloud. Lightroom Cc stores images in the Adobe cloud, which is a really nice thing. The problem is that the Adobe cloud is a little bit on the expensive side in terms of cloud storage. Certainly a lot more expensive than Amazon S3 is. But Lightroom Cc has significantly reduced capabilities compared to Lightroom Classic, which is the original Lightroom Classic program. So if you haven't played around with Lightroom, this is kind of what it looks like. The two most commonly used sections of Lightroom are library and develop. Library is where you look for your images, import them, geotag them, provide other kinds of tagging and stuff on them, add metadata. And develop is where you can do all kinds of creative or other kinds of necessary changes, edits to them. And I'll show you a couple of examples. This is an image of the Red Mill in Clinton, New Jersey. And this is a high dynamic range image. I took 5 shots of it, of the mill, obviously on a tripod, changed the exposure on each shot, and then combined them in Lightroom into one image. So the depth of color, the detail in the dark and the light sections of the image are much higher than you would get with one single photograph. That's why it's called high dynamic range. This was kind of a grab shot of the frog in our little pond out here. It was taken toward the evening, and it was just a dark, murky shot that was something that I probably in the past would have just thrown away. But I started playing with it, able to elevate the shadows and diminish some of the overly bright spots, and came up with a much more acceptable looking image. Also did some creative cropping on the shot. Doing some cropping often introduces noise because you're zooming in on a smaller area of the image. So Lightroom has some noise reduction capabilities that were employed here to take some of that noise out. This is another one that was kind of a dark, murky shot, brightened up the dark areas, got a little bit of gleam out of the rabbit's eye there, and corrected a couple of other problems, and turned a not so great grab shot into a better looking shot, especially with a little bit of cropping. This is an interesting photograph. They're grackles. I thought they were crows. In fact, I posted this in a couple of places and said, Flight of the Crows or something, and people came back and said, they're not crows, those are grackles, you idiot. I have a friend who's a professional bird photographer, actually, who almost immediately jumped on me saying that anyone would be able to know the difference between a crow and a grackle. But at any rate, this is not one photograph. This is actually, well, just to step backwards, about once a year, about 1 billion grackles, as it turns out to be, not crows, land in our property for about 5 minutes and then take off and go someplace else. They go like another half mile and then stop and then keep going and going and going. I guess one of the things they do is they're looking for farmers' fields to eat all the corn that's fallen from the after the season is over. So I looked outside one day and there were 1 billion grackles in the trees. So I went out and started shooting, and they started their movement, which was, it's just spectacular to see 1 billion, and it's not 1 billion, it's probably several thousand of these birds sort of take off and move at the same time. But I took a bunch of photos in a row and then combined them, stitched those images together. So there's actually, some of those birds are actually depicted more than one time in this image, but it's not that visible from the image when you look at it. It just looks like there's more of them than there actually were. And of course, it's a little bit of a panorama because there's actually, I think, 3 images that have been put together into this. So it's an example of a picture that simply didn't even exist in the camera at all, but has been created entirely in Lightroom. This is a similar one. It almost looks like our house is under attack or something, but actually it's just fireworks. But it's 4 or 5 images that have been put together. And in addition to combining the light trails from several images into one, also is a little bit of a example of a high dynamic range image, in that the exposure was being changed between shots. So you get much deeper colors and a lot more detail in some places than you otherwise would have gotten. The other sort of number 1, number 2 application out there is Photoshop, which in my opinion is really the gold standard in photo editing. Photoshop allows for destructive image editing. So if you start making changes and you save it, you've lost the original. And generally you use Photoshop on JPEGs as opposed to raw images, although you can edit raw images in Photoshop as well. It has the capability of importing them. Photoshop has just almost a ludicrous range of features. It's almost like ridiculous at times. And you're never going to find much of any person in the world who knows everything about Photoshop. It seems like as if for every single thing you can do, you can find someone who knows how to do it. But there's like 1 million people know 1 million different things that can be done. And that's good and bad. It means that there's a huge community of users out there and tutorials and documentation, but you have to search around to figure out how to do it. The good thing is I've never had to do anything in Photoshop that I wasn't able to find someone explaining how to do in a YouTube video or a tutorial. And of course, it's, as mentioned before, it's sold along with Lightroom for about $11 a month. Almost every third-party image processing app, so a lot of the things we'll talk about later, following this, are plugins to Photoshop. So you never really have to leave Photoshop. These Sensei features, AI features, are amazing. We'll talk about them. It requires lots of memory. The machine I use Photoshop on has 64 gigabytes of memory. And it's the first machine I've ever used Photoshop on that actually responded fast and snappily. And they have M1 chip support for the newer Apple devices. My secondary machine has an M1 chip, and I must say that it approaches the bigger, faster Windows machine in terms of speed in Photoshop. This is what the Photoshop user interface looks like. Adobe keeps a very consistent look between their programs. This was kind of a hazy shot with a long telephoto lens, a lot of cropping, was able to eliminate the haze, the atmospheric haze, and elevate the shadows to get a more usable image out of this kind of quick grab shot. You don't often see two trains pulling up right on top of each other at the same time. So it was a lucky shot while I was standing there at Metro Park. We were able to turn it into at least a usable image. This is a part of the user interface to Photoshop that shows the neural filters, which are built using this Sensei technology. And you can see what some of these are, for example, skin smoothing for portraits, super zoom, which allows you to take like a 20 megapixel image and turn it into an 80 megapixel image. JPEG artifacts removal, colorization, style transfer is kind of interesting. You have a picture of two different people, one of them with, for example, red lipstick on. You can transfer the lipstick from one person to the other person, as well as their eye makeup and other things. Smart Portrait allows you to make changes to people's heads and faces. For example, turn their eyes from looking one direction to another direction, turn their head. Turning their head doesn't work quite as well as turning their eyes, but there's a lot of useful features in there. One of them is making people look younger or older, which when you shoot portraits of people, a lot of times people really want you to make them look younger. I won't say who, but landscape mixer, I'll show you. This is kind of amazing. If you look carefully at this image, you'll see not only are the colors changing, but in some of them, it's smart enough to know that in an arid landscape, there's going to be fewer trees, and it takes trees out of the image. So it's essentially taking a landscape that you shoot and turning it into something that looks more like a landscape that it knows about, or that you've taken another photograph of. A really good program that is just coming out and is getting rave reviews is called Luminar Neo. And I've got to tell you, the interesting thing about it, it's made by a company called Skylum, which is a Ukrainian company, and they're based in Kyiv. And in fact, the folks there are really in a sad situation in that they're not able to get back to work. And some of the people have part of the company has moved outside of Ukraine, but it's available and the support team is still working. And they've done just an outstanding job with this program called Luminar Neo. It's a program that you can buy for about $75 to $150, depending upon the way that you buy it. And it provides some basic editing and noise reduction capabilities, but some really advanced automated AI tools. For example, one of them that's just incredible is power line removal. Particularly if you're taking shots in city situations, a lot of times you end up with a lot of power lines and other lines, telephone lines and things in an image. It will simply remove them for you, which in some instances you would otherwise have done using things like the magic eraser in Photoshop. But this is takes about 2 minutes on a computer using AI, as opposed to taking hours and hours and hours of editing on a screen with your hands. You can add sun rays, and these are just a small number of the cool ones. Sky augmentation, many, many, many more capabilities. This is one of the best ones. It will separate out the image, the part of the image that it thinks, or that you can define as being the important part, which is the boy, his face, legs, and the area near him, and then create a bokeh behind him where there was no bokeh before. Bokeh, of course, is sort of that creamy, smooth, out of focus look that separates the foreground from the background. Very highly desirable look, especially in portrait photography. Another example is sky augmentation, where it's able to either find the clouds and the blue sky in an otherwise cloudless blue, very, very light overexposed image and put them back in. And in fact, smart enough to put them into the reflection as well. Another interesting program that we've been playing around with is Gigapixel Ai from Topaz Laboratories. It costs about $100, and it does intelligent image scaling, upscaling without blocky artifacts. For example, it can turn a 20 megapixel file into an 80 megapixel file. It uses deep learning from millions and millions of images that it's been taught to look at. I've seen examples of it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it to put up here on the where it literally you can take an image, blow it up, get rid of all the detail, feed it back to it so there's no detail, and it finds detail in places where it's just unbelievable where it finds the detail. And it does this because it knows from looking at millions and millions of images what probably should be in the areas where it does not have pixels to, where it has to essentially fill in the pixels between the pixels that you have. This capability is particularly interesting for printing because low resolution images generally don't print well, especially when you print large ones. You know, they say an image is not a photograph until it's printed. And a lot of people don't do a lot of printing, but, and one of the reasons people don't do a lot of printing is because they usually don't turn out looking that great. But this gives you the ability to, especially when they're printed in a large format, this gives you the ability to take nice shots that look great on the web and turn them into shots that can be easily printed. Especially good in nature, birding, cropping. People do a lot of cropping in bird photography because they're small. Or fixing old historic photographs. This is a 108-year-old photograph of my grandfather, who was an early pilot. We took this cruddy old picture of his that's been lying around for years and put it through Gigapixel Ai and upscaled it. And actually restored part of his face. Now, it certainly didn't know what his face looked like, but based upon looking at millions of faces, was able to make a bunch of intelligent guesses as to what his face probably looked like, and actually did a pretty good job. There's a version of Gigapixel Ai, by the way, that works on video. And if you look on the web, you can see these restored classic videos of old cities that were shot around the turn of the century, not the turn of this century, the turn of the previous century. And it's almost spooky looking at these images because it looks like 4K video that was shot, 4K or 8K video that was shot yesterday, but it's people 100 years ago or 120 years ago that are walking around. And that's another product, by the way, from Gigapixel, from Topaz Labs that's used. Here, it might be hard to see on YouTube, on Zoom, but here's kind of like a before and after on the before on the right left side, and after on the right side. As you can see, detail that was not there in the original image has been guessed at and put in, but it does an astoundingly good job. Just sort of changing the subject a little bit, another computer-based tool that I use that's very, very useful is Cam Ranger, which is wireless tethering. The device costs about, it actually costs about $300 to $350, but with accessories, probably about $400. Most high-end bodies these days have built-in Wi-Fi or near-field communication or Bluetooth, but it usually sucks. In fact, generally speaking, I've never gotten a lot of it to work on any camera in any reliable way. But Cam Ranger essentially provides solid wireless tethering in a 100 to 200 foot range. And for product, fashion, macro, wildlife photography, it does an astounding job. If the situations where a client needs to see images and review them as they're being taken, there's nothing better than to be able to show them on a MacBook Pro or an iPad a full-blown image as opposed to a tiny little thing on the back of a camera. And it also can support things like focus stacking and HDR automation. So you can set up a program with the Cam Ranger to just go off on the camera and just take the shots that you need to have taken, and it will just shoot them in a row, store them, upload them to your system that's running Lightroom, and then process them.
Hey, Mr. Judice.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but
No problem.
I want to let you know that you have 5 minutes left for the presentations, so that we could have some time for questions that anyone might have.
Sure, I'm going to hurry up. We're almost done.
Right,
This
thank you so much.
worked out pretty well. And here's a shot that was taken with actually with the Cam Ranger 1. We actually have the Cam Ranger 2 here, which we haven't even gotten running yet. But this is a shot about 2 or 3 years ago with the Cam Ranger 1. It'd be really hard to get that close and get such a nice shot. The hummingbird is probably saying, you don't expect me to eat with that gigantic wasp that's sitting up there on that thing. But so to sum up, there's some amazing technology out there, and it's at pretty reasonable cost. One question is it taking the fun away? I don't know. Struggling with focus isn't fun for me, but maybe it's what other people consider to be fun. Is changing an image in software any different than adding a filter? Good question. Is there a risk of getting too dependent on technology? Well, there might be, but new technology keeps coming along, so why not take advantage of it? And here's a funny thing that's a little bit of a problem you need to keep an eye out for, and that's that every camera body, lens, flash, even teleconverters require firmware updates on a regular basis now. So it's a piece of maintenance that you need to keep up with. So that's the end. And I do want to just one more time say, my wish is that everyone keep the people of Skylum and Ukraine in your thoughts these days. They're a really tough situation there. Any questions for me?
So for our questions, we're actually going to be using the Zoom feature of raising your hand. So if everybody could either raise their hand when they have a question or use a reaction, that would be great.
Anyone have any other programs or products out there they'd like to recommend? Yeah, I see a hand up. From Russell? I think you're muted, because I don't hear you.
I was just applauding. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No applause necessary. Any other questions before we finish up here and move on? By the way, we should have an applause for the student hosts who have done just a magnificent job here today, setting everything up.
I think John N has a question. You can go ahead and unmute.
John?
Was that me you're referring to? I was just.
I see John N with a hand up.
Oh, that's not mine.
Might be
Okay.
muted.
Hi.
John N?
Okay. So in Photoshop, have you used like the content aware brush? Because that fixes a lot of problems. Like when something's in a scene that you don't want, it does a relatively good job, provided you don't use it as too big of a brush in an area.
I agree. Use that all the time. The other thing I use all the time is the magic healing brush.
Okay, I haven't given that much of a shot, but the
Try
content.
the magic healing brush. It's quite amazing.
Okay, because the content aware brush, I think for the audience is very, very helpful. Like I do most of my work in Lightroom, and then I go to Photoshop mostly for that. And also in their Neuro filters, they also have a nice blurring tool in the background. You just have to be careful when you're doing fashion that you don't blur out some of them if you do it too much, but you can kick back a little. But those Neuro filters are amazing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thanks for bringing that up.
Sure.
Well,
Thank you.
there's a lot of overlap between some of the programs that I talked about, and each one has its little areas that it shines in, and other areas that, you know, if you had to pick one, just my thought, it's Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop.
I agree.
Any
And
more
like-
questions?
Asking.
Seems like we have a question in the chat from Kristen. Have you ever used the On1 software?
No, I haven't, but I know people who I know some actual true professionals do use it and swear by it. I just didn't bring anything up that I haven't actually played around with and used. The other one is she referring to Capture One?
I'm not sure. It doesn't say.
There's actual on one as well. I've used it in the past and it was very good. I just haven't upgraded.
Yeah, especially with Capture One, especially is people who do a lot of tethering and fashion tend to like they tend to like it more than Lightroom.
Do you have any recommendations for open source tools for raw files?
You know, I don't, and I was thinking of putting that together. I just didn't have time. You know, probably the thing to do is to I mean, a good place to look for additional tools. Probably the sort of the hangout for a lot of people who are doing digital photography these days is DPR Review, digitalphotoreview.com, and some of the discussion forums there. There's tons and tons and tons of information. It's actually a subsidiary of Amazon, and in fact, you can find their link at the bottom of the Amazon.com webpage. The other thing I tend to like is, who I learn a lot from, is 2 YouTube channels. One is Jared Poland, who I like a lot. He's kind of an interesting character, but he has some very interesting.
Go for breakfast.
And the other is Tony and Tony Northrup. I think we need to stop now.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lou, for a wonderful talk, and for sharing with us your passion. We're gonna
Thank you, and thank you for doing such a great job of the moderation.
Of course. We're gonna take a couple minutes break. The next talk will start at 11.